to introduce Mark Mechler, co-founder of the Tea Party Patriots, and a very special person. Even if New York City doesn't like him, we like him.
So if you didn't get the New York reference, I'll tell you that story in a minute. It's not so much of an inside joke anymore. It's an incredible honor to be here. It's more than a pleasure. I have this amazing life now where I get to travel around the country to different Tea Party events, different activist events all across the country and meet people like you everywhere. It's impossible to adequately put into words how invigorating and inspiring it is to do this. So when I get introduced and people thank me, it's really humbling because my job is actually pretty easy. For folks like you that are fighting in your own community, that are fighting for the survival of the country, doing it on a daily basis here in your local community, the fight, in my opinion, is harder because you don't necessarily get what I do. You don't get to go to events like this in southern Florida, or on the border in Texas, or up in Seattle, Washington, or in the heartland in Kansas City. You don't get to see that every single day, and I mean every day, that there are meetings like this going on all across the country. Literally everywhere. I promise you, right now, today, at this moment, in other community facilities like this, in churches, in people's homes, meetings just like this are taking place. So for me, this is where I draw my sustenance every day. This is what makes it makes me able to go out and to do what I do and to be away from my family so much. I think everybody's fighting. We're all fighting for the same thing. We're fighting for the country, for the heart and soul of the country. We're fighting for the republic. And we think back to the founders and what they sacrificed. We're having some conversation over here with the pastor while we were eating lunch about what was sacrificed by the founders of the country and how extraordinary it was. And I do a lot of reading in history. I haven't read a lot of history previous to the movement, but I've started to. I want to understand how this all got started, why this is so extraordinary. And when I read all this stuff, I keep coming back to a single word. And I think this sums up the essence of what we're fighting for. When I read the founders' words, when I read the history of that time, when I see the folks in this room that have actually served in the military and put it all on the line, when I think about the folks that aren't in this room because they not only put it all on the line, but they actually made that sacrifice. What we're fighting for, in essence, is liberty. Right? Would you guys agree with that? That's the fundamental idea around which this country is based. It's something that we have the right to. We have the right to, we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Liberty is part of God's law, it's natural law. Human beings are supposed to live in a state of liberty. And we think of that as a normal thing. We think, as Americans, that that's the way things are, that's the way things have always been, and that's the way they're supposed to be. The reality is, if you look at the continuum of human history, liberty is not the norm. You've got this sliding scale between liberty and tyranny. If you look throughout human history, tyranny is the norm. It's extraordinary. Sometimes, I know even us who are engaged in the fight, we forget that this little blip of history that is the United States of America, where we were based around this idea of liberty, the government was founded around this idea, it's unique in human history. It had never been done before in this way, to this extent. And so this is America, this is our unique birthright as Americans. It's part of literally our country's DNA is the idea of liberty. America is also unique because we are a country founded on an idea. We were not an empire. We were not founded as an empire. We were not founded out of military conquest. We were founded around this idea of liberty. We're unique because we're founded on a constitution that is different than all other founding documents in the world. This is the only founding charter in the history of the world that is designed specifically to be used as a weapon by the people against their government. That's truly unique. It's because the founders understood that liberty was fragile and that the government would always, throughout human history, and it wasn't going to be any different here in this country, would always work to deprive us of liberty. It's the nature of government. Government grows, government becomes more powerful, whether it's local government or federal government, and every time the government grows bigger, the citizen grows smaller. So the founders were wise enough to give us a weapon in the form of that incredible document, the Constitution of the United States, to wield against the government. That makes us unusual. I think what also makes us unusual is that this government really is of, for, and by the people. And it is based around liberty. And we talk about the founders a lot. I love to study the founders, and they were very amazing men. They were men specifically made for the times. They knew a lot, they studied a lot, they understood a lot of human history. But I also think it's important to understand that though they were great men, they're no different than we are today. They were still just human beings. We make them into myths, I think, we have over the last couple of hundred years because of what they accomplished. But we also have to remember that these were men who arose out of their communities. Right? They were voted on. Some of them ultimately voted out. They were still just folks, just regular people, farmers, merchants, business people who came out of their communities and were actually elected by what I think are some extraordinary communities. That's what America is today. We're just a conglomeration of extraordinary communities. So I don't think it's any different for us than it was for them. And I don't think we should separate ourselves from them and think of them as these mythological figures that are just historical, because they are us and we are them. It's the same thing. I think this is best illustrated if you look at the real history of the American Revolution. And there was a guy in 1843 by the name of Mellon Chamberlain who was going around and was trying to document the last remaining survivors of the American Revolution. They were getting up there in years. He was worried that their memories would be fading, that they would be moving on from this earth, and that people wouldn't know their stories. And Chamberlain happened to run across a guy in North Carolina by the name of Levi Preston. Preston had participated in 1775 at the Battle at Concord. And he was about early 20s, maybe 23 years old at the time he participated. And when Chamberlain crossed paths with him, he was 91 years old. And so Chamberlain wanted to know from Preston why he fought. And he asked him, Mr. Preston, what is it that caused you to take the field that day against those redcoats? Better armed, better trained, the most intimidating military force in the history of the world. What caused you as a young man to go on that field? Was it the Stamp Act? Was it the fact that you had to buy those stamps and affix them to any official document? And Preston said, son, I know nothing about no stamps. I never bought one. And he said, well, it must have been the tea then. You heard about what happened in Boston Harbor with the tea, and the British were imposing taxes on the tea, and obviously this made you so angry that you decided to go out and fight against those redcoats. And he said, son, we didn't drink no tea, we were just farmers. And he said, well, what is it? What would have made you go out and risk your life and put everything on the line against those redcoats? It wasn't the taxes, it wasn't the tea, what was it? And he said, son, in going for them redcoats, what we meant was this. We had always governed ourselves, and we always intended that we should. And them redcoats intended that we shouldn't. That was it. It's not the words of Washington so eloquent. It wasn't what Adams or Madison were saying. It wasn't the comparative world history that Preston had this incredible understanding of world history and a sophisticated view. Preston just knew that we as Americans had always governed ourselves and that we always should. Do you guys agree with that sentiment? Right? You're just Levi Preston, and there are millions of us who feel this way about liberty. It's literally in our very DNA, our national DNA. It's an extraordinary thing. We're different in this way than any other country. A lot of people today try to say that America is not anything special. We're not an exceptional nation. We're not extraordinary. That's not true. This is extraordinary. We are factually extraordinary if you look at this scope of human history. So he understood the idea of liberty, and liberty was actually visceral to people like that. The redcoats had come, the British had come, and they were there to take that history from them. When I think back of the scope of history, what I learned in high school, junior high, high school, maybe a little bit in college, and I think back to my studies, I think, history started on the Americas, maybe for us, for the European settlers in the Americas at Jamestown, right? We think of that as the first permanent settlement here on the continent. And then it seems like the way they teach history in school, it's